So I was asked to speak today to talk about I was asked to talk about the practical implications of some of the things that we've been learning about today with regard to scholarly communications and to publishing, which are my areas of expertise. So being a librarian, a lot of my job is answering questions and helping people find information. And so I've been asked a lot recently, especially since I not only cover scholarly communications and publishing, but my background is in digital scholarship and in helping people to build digital projects. And I also do our programming resources and services around open data here. So I have a little bit more of a tech background, and people have been coming and asking lots of questions around AI, and specifically, can I do this with AI? Should I use AI in this particular way? And so this presentation is based off of how I've been helping our students, faculty, instructors, and also the administrators at the University of Maryland to navigate these kinds of questions. And the way that I've been doing that is really thinking about the three things that are in the subtitle on this presentation, which are what we understand around the current legal landscape. The thing about AI is that it really came out and into our public consciousness, and the availability and the variety of AI tools that are available to us really exploded about a year and a half ago. And the legal landscape has not really had a chance to catch up and create a lot of rules in terms of what it is that we are and aren't allowed to do with AI. But one space in which we have some guidance, or at least some ideas about how AI might be regulated in the near future, is copyright. And that's, of course, a very important area of consideration for us as knowledge producers and publishers of our own work, and as folks who work in positions as editors and people who manage publications and policies around publishing work of others as well as themselves. And so understanding a little bit about the copyright landscape can help us to understand some of those can I's and to have an understanding of what may or may not be problematic in the future as we make decisions about what we're doing with AI now. Understanding how AI tools can be used in research and publishing. So, what's sort of within the realm of possibility, and what are those tools, and how as a community have we been making policy and coming to consensus about what we feel is appropriate in terms of the use of these kinds of tools in the creation and the publication of our research and different forms of scholarly communication. And so that again can help us understanding a little bit about the consensus that we've reached as editors, as members of scholarly societies, as the publishers have put out policies and things like that. That can also help to answer some of those can I questions. But between those policies and those laws and all of the different things that people can do with AI tools is a pretty deep gulf of nebulous questions that still exist. And so I'm hoping that I can also guide you through some of the questions and decision-making frameworks that I've developed along with our faculty and students based on the kinds of questions and things that have been coming through my door to help us think about how to make those difficult decisions in an informed way, based on, that's where the ethics comes into this conversation, is when there isn't somebody telling you that you absolutely can or cannot do something. What are the things to consider to help us to make decisions and to guide others, our faculty and students, and other folks in our academic communities in making these kinds of decisions in the absence of those kinds of rules? So to talk about AI and copyright, I'm going to start off with just a few copyright basics, because I never assume that everybody understands everything about copyright, which is a very confusing subject. First of all, copyright is a bundle of exclusive rights to a piece of intangible or intellectual property. So the difference between owning the copyright on the characters and plot line of a book that you came up with versus owning a piece of physical property, so the actual copy of the book. So I can buy a copy of the book and I own that, but the author, the person who came up with the story, or possibly their publisher, if they have signed over the copyright to somebody else, owns that intellectual property, the underlying ideas that are part of that story. Um, the author is always the first copyright owner, but copyright can be transferred. That often happens when you sign a contract, right, with a publisher. And copyright also expires, but it has a very long life. So in America, copyright is for the lifetime of the creator plus 70 years. So copyright does expire, it goes away eventually, but it lasts for a really long time. There are works that are in the public domain, works that are not protected by intellectual property laws. Usually what happens is that the material is something that passed into the public domain because we went out of that expiration period. So things that were written in the 19th century, the great novels of the Brontes or Charles Dickens, and that's one of the reasons why we have lots of adaptations of those in television dramas and things like that, because the copyright is no longer owned. Artists can decide to waive their copyright, although this doesn't happen very often. And there are works that are in the public domain because they were created and published by a government entity. And so that's something to keep in mind as well, that things that were created for the public good are often do not have a copyright protection because they're for everybody to use and are part of that public domain. Licenses are a way that you can give people permission to use stuff that's copyrighted. So I can transfer my whole copyright to somebody else when I sign an author contract, but it's possible that I want to retain copyright over my work, but I want to tell a movie studio, if we're using the book example, that they can make a version of my movie or my book into a movie. So I can give them a license to use my characters and my plot, but only to make that movie, and perhaps only to make an English language version of that movie. So I could also license a French film company to make a French adaptation of my story. So licenses are a way that we can allow people to use our copyrighted works without giving up the copyright. We've had a lot of people who are much more knowledgeable about the AI technology talk to us today about how AI works. But to kind of focus this around why copyright is so implicated in when we're talking about AI and rulemaking and lawmaking around AI, we have to think about the fact, or, central to this is you can't teach an AI tool or an AI algorithm to do anything without training it on something. So in order for all of these generative AI tools, things that are, creating texts, creating images, in order for them to be able to do that, we need to give them large data sets with lots of examples of content so that they can identify patterns and use those to simulate the human behavior, the human creative output. So large language models like ChatGPT are looking at lots of examples of different kinds of texts and using those to predict the next word that might come in a sequence. If we have a tool like Midjourney, which creates images, we would be thinking about, or we would be showing it lots of examples of impressionist works that we could say, create something in the style of a French impressionist artist. And it would know that that meant a particular kind of use of light and brushwork, right? So we'd have to show them examples, and that means ingesting lots and lots of content, much of which is still in copyright. AI tools rely on training data that's pulled from the internet, and a lot of it is collected through web scraping. So you may have heard of the Common Crawl, which is essentially a large web scrape that comes through and pulls everything that it can off of the internet on a regular basis and ingests it into these data sets. And the reason that we mention this is because these web scrapes are just indiscriminately pulling a lot of content off of the internet. And there aren't necessarily, although there can be targeted scrapes of certain kinds of content, and there aren't necessarily logs or, specific information about what's been pulled into these data sets. It's just as much as possible, and as much of the complete internet as we can get. Data sets can be created or crafted, meaning that you can look at or develop a data set that only uses specific information that's been chosen based on things that are outside of copyright. So you could create something that's created entirely out of works in the public domain. You could also license, so you could pay copyright owners to utilize or incorporate their materials into your data set. But this is not how most of the data sets for the huge data models that are powering things like ChatGPT and some of these other really powerful, commonly used models are created. So one of the first questions that we actually can sort of answer is, are AI works copyrightable? So if you use an AI to, write an article, if you use it to create an image or make a song, is that something that you can own the copyright to? And while there is not actually law on this at the moment, because we haven't done a lot of legal rulemaking or lawmaking around AI technologies at this point, we do know, or in the US, the Copyright Office has issued a policy that works generated by AI are not copyrightable due to the fact that they do not meet the human authorship requirement. So in order for something to be considered intellectual property that can be registered for a copyright with the US Copyright Office, it needs to be created by a human, and they've determined that AIs are not humans. And so if you make something with an AI, it cannot be registered for a copyright. However, we are expecting the lines around copyrightability to shift based on what the technologies can do, how people argue their cases and how things shake out in court. So two of the cases that have illustrated the Copyright Office's policy, but are still in active legal situations are demonstrated here. So we have a graphic novel by an artist called Kristina Kashtanova, and she used the AI tool Midjourney to create the images for a graphic novel that she wrote the story and the dialogue and all of the text for. And she actually registered her graphic novel with the Copyright Office, received a registration, but later went online and told everybody that she had used an AI tool to generate the images. And so the Copyright Office ended up revoking her registration and said that the copyright could be, or the registration could be applied to the story, to the text, but not to the images which were generated by the AI tool. And so this has created or demonstrated a registration policy that says that if you disclose the use of the AI, that will help the copyright registration experts to help you register what is copyrightable within your product, and will help you to exclude the materials that are not subject to copyright registration or copyright law in the US. The picture at the bottom, Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial by Jason Allen, actually won an art prize at the, oh gosh, I've forgotten which state fair, one of the state fairs, I think 2 summers ago. And this is, again, a piece that was created using Midjourney. And this is something that the creator is actively suing the Copyright Office for not allowing him to register. His argument is that he spent over 100 hours and 600 different prompts to help to refine and sort of like create this image using the AI tool, but he's saying he put a lot of his own sort of like vision and ideas into the creation of this and then touched it up in Photoshop after it came out the other end. But still the Copyright Office and the registration specialists have determined that he still did not create this, but what sort of counts as authorship and human action in creating something is what is kind of at debate here. And you could see how if a court decides to rule in his favor on the appeal and say that crafting prompts or doing this kind of call and response with the AI tool could be conceived of as creative human authorship, that would shift the line on what is and is not copyrightable when it comes out the other end of an AI tool. The other big question that we get a lot is about training data. So, is it legal for somebody to put all of this stuff into the AI tools? And if somebody takes something of mine and puts it into an AI, like, do I have any recourse against that? And at the moment, there is no law that says that that is not legal. But there is, again, active legal cases that are alleging that this is not okay. And the results of those will help us to understand a little bit more about what the courts will tolerate and what we consider to be legal in the country about training data ingestion and the rights of copyright owners in preventing people from using their work in this way. And the biggest case right now in that space is the New York Times, who are suing OpenAI over the use of their copyrighted content. So for ingesting their news stories and using those to train ChatGPT and other chatbots that they allege are damaging their business models, because people are just going to ChatGPT and typing in, like, tell me about, what the Democrats think on this particular topic, or, like, tell me about, mortgage rates or something, and using that as a way to synthesize and pull information instead of going to the source, paying a subscription and getting the information directly from the journalistic entity. So it's certainly a space where, again, there is no law, but you could see how if you can make a case for market harm, and the New York Times is aiming to do that, that they could have a ruling in their favor that this is something, the ingestion of this copyrighted material is harming their business, and that law could shift. At the moment, there is an argument, and people are thinking about whether or not the incorporation of this copyrighted material into the training data falls under the terms of fair use. Fair use is a doctrine in the United States that allows the use of copyrighted materials in certain circumstances. So for instance, a lot of times people will talk about how fair use allows us to use copyrighted materials in the classroom as part of our teaching. We weren't going to sell these things. We weren't selling tickets to come into our classroom. So this allows us to use materials, for a purpose that's for the greater good. Fair use also applies in journalism, where, it would be cost prohibitive or time prohibitive to have to seek permission or pay licensing fees to utilize materials. And this often comes into play with research and scholarship as well. So the big case, or the relationship here, the thinking about whether or not materials that are pulled from the internet incorporated into this training data could be construed as fair use, have been related to two of the biggest cases that have talked about the training of computer models and the sort of technology space around the use of copyrighted content. And that's the Authors Guild versus Google Books, and Authors Guild versus HathiTrust. And in both cases, the ingestion of large amounts of training data, so the full text scanning and ingestion of books into the Google Books model, and then their interface where you can look up books and see that. And the HathiTrust, which powers a text mining and digital tools infrastructure for people who are participating in the digital humanities, both of these were ruled to be fair use, not only because of the context that they were being used for, research purposes, or had sort of a connection to academia and that sort of thing, but also because there was a transformation of the information, that they weren't just using the copyrighted material to allow people to read the books. They were using it to create this interface that allows you can see the links to connect the dots between materials that are published by different publishers, materials that are published in certain languages, to look up books that are published by the same authors. And so they're creating this network of data and allowing you to view that information in these different formats and to look at the connections between those things in the Google Books interface. And then here you can see in the HathiTrust, this is an example of where they're looking for the frequency of a particular word in a corpus. And so they've taken, all of these many books that they've ingested through the Google Books project, looked up the word bookworm in all of those, and traced when that word sort of hit a peak in terms of its use through there. And so this, again, was deemed to be a transformative use. And you could see how this argument might apply in the AI space, where we're thinking about the ingestion of all of these different materials into these machine learning algorithms, where they're being broken down into patterns and connections between different images or texts, and then being used to recombine and spit out these other things, these other texts or images that are not necessarily copies of the other materials, but are potentially or argued to be transformative. So then we think about output infringement liability. So we've talked about the people who are putting the stuff into the training model and whether that's okay and what recourse do I have. But what if I create something with an AI and somebody else is like, that infringes my copyright, it looks too close to my artwork? What if I build an AI tool and somebody makes something with it that then gets involved in a copyright dispute? Do I have some sort of liability as the person who made that thing? Some of the questions or the legal theory that's underpinning these conversations are about thinking about output liability and the role of the platform as somebody who is responsible for or may be subject to secondary liability in this space. So one of these, you might have heard people talking a lot lately about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The reason why people have been talking about it over the last few years is because it talks about the neutrality or the rights of a service provider. So think Facebook, Twitter, these platforms that are online, and whether or not they have responsibilities or should not be doing certain kinds of content moderation and things like that. So there is the belief or the right of that platform in this provision to be not treated as a publisher or speaker of the information. And so the application of the law under Section 230 might suggest that if you create an AI tool or an AI platform and somebody makes something that is infringing using that or inputs data that is copyrighted into your model, that you're just the service provider, you're just the platform, and you are not necessarily going to be liable if things come out of it or go into it that are infringing on somebody's copyright. However, standing against that, there's the case from Napster in 2001, where Napster was determined to be liable in the copyright infringement of all the people who were taking and copying music using their platform because the functionalities and the lack of protection that they had built into their platform. So these two things are sort of in tension with one another. And again, thinking about what current case law and the legal thinking in this space is telling us about whether or not these are things that we need to be concerned about or may affect us if we use these tools going forward. This is a space where I'd say that there's probably a little bit more of a gray area in terms of how people are determining whether or not this is going to be a problem going forward. The example of this that most people talk about in terms of output liability is called the Snoopy problem. So we think about the possibility of building technical protections into some of these tools to prevent people from creating infringing outputs. One of the things that people have found is that you can build in protections so that it is not able to or is prevented from creating carbon copies of, say, like the Mona Lisa, but characters And certain underlying ideas, once ingested, are very difficult to divorce from their meaning within the AI. There was a great presentation this morning where somebody said, we don't really know exactly how the AIs work to some extent. And so some of the issues around characters and copyright infringement seem to be a little unsolvable at the moment. So if you type into an AI, dog sitting on a red house, you're gonna usually end up with a picture of Snoopy. If you say ice princess, you're very likely to get a picture of Elsa from Frozen. If you say wizard school, you're gonna get something that looks very like the castle in Hogwarts from Harry Potter. And so there are certain things that you have to expect or understand are not necessarily preventable in terms of the construction of the AIs and your liability or potential for copyright infringement when you're either using or building these things. So the second sort of area that we were going to look at is, what's going on in that space. So we understand having that copyright background gives us an idea of what is currently allowed, and based on current case law and some of the things that are going on in that space, the conversations that are happening in the legal landscape, that gives us a framework for where we could run into trouble in the future. And what we should maybe be thinking about if we are building tools or thinking about using these things in our work in terms of what could be problematic for us from a legal perspective. But there are also community consensus, so things that we've decided as an academic and scholarly community in terms of what we should be doing in terms of utilizing these tools, whether or not we should be using them in certain ways, and how we should be disclosing or talking about them. So many academic publishers and publications have stated policies around using generative AI. And so you can often, or in many cases, go to your publisher's website if you're considering publishing with a particular journal. If you are the editor for a journal or work with a scholarly society, you may go to COPE, the Community on Publication Ethics, or an editorial society. There are many of these policies that have been written and give some guidance on what the current thinking is, or specifically from your publisher, what the rules are in terms of what you're allowed to use and what you need to disclose. An interesting thing is that as AI has continued to expand and sort of change to increase the number of things that it can do and is much more widely available. I've actually seen these policies, which I've been monitoring and providing access to for people, change a bit over the last year and a half, from very prescriptive policies that were like, you do not use this, it is not allowed in our journal, to recognition that AI is a tool that does a lot of really cool things and can be really helpful. And have some policies that acknowledge that and try to put guardrails around what it is that we feel is acceptable. And if we are going to be experimenting and submitting to the reality that this is something that is part of our digital landscape and probably part of our research and publishing processes as well. So most of these policies stress the limitations and do sometimes restrict authors in their use of AI based on some of these copyright rules. So some of these publishers will tell you, you cannot use this to create illustrations or other, visualizations or other materials, supplemental things for your publication. And the reason for that is usually because then those pieces are not copyrightable by the publisher and they will not have control over those going forward. They highlight the importance of transparency and disclosure. And so, if you're going to use AI, you have to tell us where and how and potentially why, right? They encourage authors to review the work. So they're very explicit about the potential for inaccuracy and the potential for plagiarism. And there is an onus on the author to be reviewing their work and making sure that those things are not a problem. And they also make distinctions between AI assistance and generative AI. And there is, I think, throughout the community, a concept that we shouldn't be using this as an authoring tool. We don't, want to replace or imagine that people are using AI in place of themselves as a critical researcher and writer, but we are open to the concept of using AI tools in assistive ways. Some of these assistive ways, so outlining and structuring, assistance with grammatical errors, writing in a non-native language, creating translations, making figures, tables, and formatting bibliographies, and some of that stuff that can take forever, be very temperamental, but could really help us to create higher quality pieces of material, or do stuff a little bit faster than we would be able to do it on our own. There's also a landscape of research-specific AI tools, some of which you may have used or some of which your students may be using. So there are tools that can help you to query individual written documents or summarize papers, things that help you to search for academic papers or create citation maps, so to sort of like get you started on your lit review or research process, to help you organize citations. And then there are some tools like Scopus AI, which is relatively newly introduced, or Dimensions, that maintain licensed or corpuses of materials that they or the publisher owns, and allow you to search through those materials, analyze them, and look at things like metrics, and understand impact of certain works, and sort of organize things that way, because they've already been collecting those kinds of things. And so the questions that I often ask people, or guide people to think about when they're deciding whether or not to use these kinds of tools, are, if you're going to use something, first of all, can you disclose it, and do you feel comfortable, right? So if you are using something, all of the policy guidelines and sort of our own individual compass says we have to disclose the use of these. And if you don't feel comfortable telling somebody that you used it, then that's usually a good sign to you that either it doesn't feel like it is, kosher to you, or that you're replacing some part of your research process that's important for you to do, with this tool. Or perhaps that your community is not ready for people to use a tool to replace that. And that's an important thing to acknowledge as well, in terms of thinking about whether or not, you want to push the boundary on that, or if that might be, disqualifying or be problematic for you when you go to publish that work. We've talked a lot, lots of people have mentioned some of the pitfalls of using these kinds of tools. And so those are the kinds of things to consider as well. The potential for plagiarism. Have you checked your work well enough? You can use these to speed up processes, and it can also slow you down, because you need to check the AI's work and not assume that the things that it's done, have been correct. A lot of these tools, we don't know what their data sources are, right? So we talked about that common crawl. Some of these AI research tools are drawing from academic databases, perhaps, but we don't necessarily know where all of their data is coming from. And so we can't always trust the materials that are coming to us. We can't trust that they are not plagiarizing material. And we also can't trust necessarily, we've talked, I'm sure, other people have talked about hallucinations. So the propensity of AI tools to make stuff up. And so there is a certain amount of fact checking, reviewing of an AI's work that you need to be in for if you are considering using these in your own work. I've also gotten lots of questions about using AI tools for research integrity. So thinking about administrators, instructors, other folks who are using AI tools, and sort of what's available in the space there. And obviously you can think about the different ways in which AI could be threatening to research integrity, right? So people using ChatGPT and other authoring tools to create papers that are full of false data and false and hallucinations and sort of incorrect things, and those entering the scholarly record and perhaps getting cited and used by other people and introducing false information, right? And then the like problem of peer reviews and other materials that are other ways of using AI to disrupt or denude the publishing process. And so the question I get a lot is, well, are there AI tools that I can use to counteract some of these things? And the answer is perhaps. So there are tools, new ones every minute, that are supposed to be able to help detect the use of AI in different kinds of material. So whether that's text or images or anything like that. And some of them do work to varying degrees. There are some interesting uses of AI to look up or help with other research integrity issues. So maybe not always detecting, was this article entirely written by ChatGPT or how much, but they're interesting algorithm that can look through papers and look for duplicated images. So because they're great at spotting patterns, they can see if there's, photographs or figures that have been copied from one to another, and that indicates that somebody was stealing or utilizing data or substantiating evidence that they didn't create out of their own lab or their own process. It is also really helpful way to kind of look through the content of an entire journal or entire publication and determining whether or not those publications meet the hallmarks of predatory journals. I know that's a concern for a lot of folks. And so there may be some really useful ways in which some of these research integrity tools can be used to help improve the landscape, in addition to or beyond just the detection of things that were created by AI. And so again, sort of thinking about pluses and minuses of using some of these tools. So they're not 100% accurate. They can flag substantial similarity, but there's work that you have to do on top of using this, to make sure that you are not inadvertently or incorrectly accusing someone of utilizing an AI tool or doing some plagiarism or something like that just because an AI research integrity tool has flagged it. For instance, they flag things that are written by non-native English language speakers at a much higher rate. And so, they're looking for things that, don't seem fluent or incongruent with the patterns of the things that they've been reading before. So somebody who makes a lot of grammatical errors or uses sort of funky construction is going to get flagged at a higher rate. And so that's sort of an ethical question and a bias issue with the AI integrity tools. So licensed versions of softwares might afford you some more control about how content that you put into these tools is saved or deleted or reused. So one thing that I know, or was the case at the beginning of the summer at least, is that BTAA schools have not turned on the AI tools in Turnitin software that people use to check student work. So we are thinking about the value of protecting unpublished work or student work from going into these large language models and how it might be reused as well. Licensed versions of stuff that help us to control what goes in, what gets saved, what gets reused of those tools might be something to consider. And so, thinking about that these tools could be helpful, but they also could be infringing, if we think about that, or against the wishes of the people who are submitting to our journals, of our students who are turning in work, that we're adding their material, some of which is not even published yet, into these large language models and sort of incorporating their ideas and their intellectual property into this data soup. So these ethical considerations, right, the spaces in between. Should I use AI to do all of these different things? And we've talked about, what's coming down the pike in terms of the legal landscape, and what we've all kind of talked about are, what the tools are actually capable of and what the policies that we've determined as a community. So should we use the tools? Would you feel comfortable? That's, number one, right? So that's your internal, your moral compass, your question for yourself about, do I feel comfortable about using this? And one other question that I often use clarifying this for folks is this a tool, or is it replacing another tool or a service if you use the AI tool? And how does that make you feel, right? So would you hire a copy editor or a designer to do this work? Or would you take it to like the disability office on campus if you needed a transcript? And does that, ease a burden on them, or would you not have the financial resources in order to be able to do that otherwise? Or are you taking work away from somebody who was potentially providing that service to you? And does that help you to think about whether or not you want to use this? Oftentimes, though, it can be really helpful for people to think about, I'm going to use this AI tool and it's going to allow me to do something new, right? So I'm going to be able to add alt text to all of these things, or create a transcript, or create visualizations that I would not otherwise have the time or the funding to be able to add. And sometimes that can be helpful for people that, it's a value add for them to be able to utilize this tool. When you use the tool, right, especially if you're using something that's doing generative AI, or it's giving you a result that you're going to use to take some action, for a research integrity thing, you get an output, right? And so you have to think about, how much do I trust this output? Where did the information come from? So what data set is it using? So if there are citations, have I checked that they're accurate? Can we check and verify all of the information? What quality of databases, if I'm, doing a literature review, or I'm using this to, create a citation map or something like that. What quality of databases, or where is it drawing the data from? And are you accounting for bias and inaccuracy? So this is what we were talking about. If you're choosing to use an AI tool, there's some post work that you need to do. And are you accounting for that and giving yourself the time and thinking critically about all the different steps that need to happen once you've created that output? Should I put my own or others' work into an AI? So we've talked about the common crawl, but when you're doing stuff like talking to an AI chatbot, if you are asking one of these tools to preview and summarize a PDF for you, all these different things mean that you're putting other people's work into the AI, or your own. And so when you're thinking about that, you can, this is, one here is, you can make your own decisions about your creative and scholarly work. And we've talked about some of the things that we know about, infringement, about the likelihood or possibility that people, could create stuff using your work as, part of that data soup. So you've got a sense, hopefully, or, you can help faculty or students to understand what the implications of putting your stuff into this model are. But we want to show a lot of deference and caution around other people's work, right? Because that's not a choice they're making for themselves if you're putting their stuff directly into there. And this is especially important when we're thinking about student work, or if we're in a position where we're using these tools to check for plagiarism and stuff like that as a journal editor, or somebody who's in, an administrative position, that these are unpublished works and things that people, may not want to be part of this data set, because they have not made the choice to publish it or post it publicly on the internet yet. So that's making a really strong choice for that person. You have to assume what's being put in there is used to train the machine learning model, unless you've been told explicitly that it's not. And so I always tell people to read the user agreements before you sign up for stuff, which is not something that people often take the time to do. But reading the user agreements before you sign up and utilize tools can really give you a sense of comfort, or at least help you to be an informed decision maker when you're putting your work into or using one of these tools. Is there a possibility that you could create a data set using public domain or openly licensed materials? Or could you seek permission or license the content that you want to put into those? So I've worked with some groups, especially students, who are building tools to help create open educational resources. They wanted to train the model on open educational resources. So we helped them to source and create a data set that was made with materials that were openly licensed with Creative Commons licenses that had terms that would allow the students to reuse the work under the terms of the license. So again, it can create extra time, but if you are concerned about some of those platform and output liability questions, if you're building something, if you're creating a data set, taking the time to actively license the content or to source or create data would be one way that you could help to protect yourself against that stuff. And again, in terms of thinking about creating a more ethical data set and thinking about valuing and protecting the copyright and the intellectual property rights of others, that could be a way to go as well. However, we want to make sure that we are not sharing human subject data or student identifiable information in these things. So thinking about the content that goes into there and being very thoughtful about what it is that we're putting into AI just in general. There are a couple of other things that I asked people to consider that we kind of haven't touched on here, and I'll brush through these, but I think they're important. Using proprietary technologies can really be a sustainability issue for your work. A lot of these tools are really cool and really new. And people are, developing these tools, putting them out online, making them freely available, but they may not be available or may not be free for as long as you are working on your research project or your organization is using them for some research integrity purpose. So if you tie your process to a tool that somebody made and that organization runs out of money, or that graduate student graduates and decides not to maintain that server anymore, then you're going to be in trouble because you can't use that thing anymore, or because you put all of your data and your information into there and there's no way to export it, right? So I put my little Adobe Flash player picture in there as an example of a technology that everybody was using, seemed really widespread, was deprecated and left, people with all these gaps on their web pages all around the space. We can, use a research method or a tool, but we have to think about whether or not, especially with these technologies that are popping up new all the time, whether or not we want to invest in utilizing those. And a lot of these tools, people build them and hope that they'll get bought by Microsoft or OpenAI or some of these other places, at which point they may become paid or subscription services. So just a thought about whether or not you want to use a tool should also be thinking about the sustainability of your research process or your internal processes, depending on what it is that you're doing with that tool. The other thing is that there are some not so great labor practices and environmental impacts that are associated with these. So a lot of the data labeling, the transcription, and other tasks that are used to train the models are performed by people who are paid very low wages. So there are data practices that are associated with these. They don't sort of exist in a computer bubble. There are people who are impacted by these technologies. And the environmental impacts, so thinking about how training a single AI model can use as much water as the average person uses over 27 years. And so I get a question a lot that's like, well, what if I have my students create little graphics and pictures in Adobe using the AI instead of having them look up things that are Creative Commons licensed on Wikimedia Commons? And yes, you can do that. And it, means that the students, are saving a little bit of time, and we don't have to worry about the fact that, they're maybe not as good about parsing all of the copyright information and worry about that they might do something infringing. But if every time somebody decides not to take 5 minutes to look something up on the internet and use one of these tools, thinking about the environmental impacts of that over time might be, something to give you pause in terms of using this as a time saver or something to make things go a little quicker. It's possible that you might want to take the time to do that and think about the, larger overreaching impacts of the things that you're doing. And the last thing is that those disclosures are so important, and just highlighting that in addition to disclosing to your publisher that you are using AI in the publication of your materials, there are some other people that you want to be disclosing to. So we talked about the intellectual property ownership piece. The importance of disclosing to funders at the point where you are applying for grants or are updating funders on your research process, being transparent about your use of AI tools. Maybe they're totally cool with it. Don't hide that you are using AI tools as part of your research process, or you may be using it as part of your publishing or drafting process from your funders, but being upfront so you don't end up in a situation where somebody says, we didn't okay that, or that's not okay with us, especially as these policies are developing over time, and grants and the funding process and the research process can take a really long time. We want to be telling people in the research community about AI and the way that we're using it, not only because we want them, we want to be transparent with them, but it's important for reproducibility and for them to understand how they might use these tools to further their research. So thinking about these, again, not just as like a boogeyman, but something that we're telling people about and incorporating into our research and sharing out with the community. There's also the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, I think is a helpful document for people to take a look at, particularly for this group, which often is thinking about, teaching our faculty and creating policy, and thinking about when we should disclose to students and human subjects, how we should incorporate these kinds of disclosures into our future IRB requirements, and the rules that we have around human subjects and people who are contributing data and information to our research, and whether or not those sorts of things should end up in AI models or be used in those kinds of tools in the future. And that's where I will stop for today, and can take questions if there is any time left.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was amazing. You talked about things that I have probably not considered before, so that was very, very informative. The first question from the chat is, why is using big data to train a large language model different from using big data to educate a human, I think, for copyright purposes? What is the difference?
So at the moment, we haven't determined that there is a difference. So one of the arguments around like a fair use argument for the use of data to train the model is that it's being used for teaching and for education. And I don't know if that argument is going to hold water going forward, like whether or not a court is going to decide in the same way that, somebody giving 600 prompts to Midjourney still didn't like equate to human authorship. I don't know if some court down the line is going to be like, the computer can't actually learn, or the model can't learn, but that is an argument that people are making, that there's an equivalency between using this, as training or as educational material for the large language model. And so at the moment, there is not a clear distinction between those two things.
Yeah, the cases that you presented in ongoing lawsuits, that was very interesting. And it's I guess in your opinion, those would be considerations that would I guess shape the regulatory landscape or the writing of laws to do with AI in this particular state?
The two cases that I referred to, the Kostanova, I always pronounce that wrong, sorry, and Allen cases, those are specific to copyright registration. And copyright registration is organized or moderated by the US Copyright Office. And so it's a policy, right, that they have around the copyright is the law, and the registration policies and procedures are organized and regulated by the Copyright Office. So if those cases were to, succeed on appeal, because at the moment they've both been determined that they're not winning on those at the moment, that would cause potentially the Copyright Office to have to change their registration policies. The thing is that they might impact future lawmaking, because we might amend the copyright statutes or introduce new legislation. Congress would have to do this to change the definition of what is copyrightable, or to specifically address the copyrightability of AI impacted or AI generated works. So if those cases were successful, or there's a lot of like lobbying, or there are a lot of these cases, that might push Congress to introduce or build that kind of legislation. At the moment, where they are is that they've asked the Copyright Office to develop a series of reports about different aspects of copyright. And so the first of those came out, and that was about digital replicas, so like deep fakes and stuff like that, which was not super applicable for this particular conversation. But those are coming down the pike, and those could be an interesting space to watch for people who are interested in kind of learning about, what kind of, how again, current case law and legal thinkers are shaping or thinking about shaping this space. And their recommendations are going to help guide Congress in creating legislation around this, which seems to be the goal because they commissioned these reports.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's forthcoming, but it's not, don't expect it in the near future.
Yeah, well, and we all know how quickly legislation
Right.
gets written and passed here in the States. And so, to understand sort of what the big questions are at the moment is valuable, because I think that's the space we're going to be in for a little while.
Okay, so then to switch gears quite a bit, you mentioned that it's uncertain how or if data or information can truly be scrubbed from an AI system's memory, if you will, or its stored or training data. And I know a number of other presenters, including yourself, also talked about AI hallucinations. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because this sounds like a pretty concerning source of misinformation.
So yes, well, so the two things are slightly different. So
Oh,
one is that the data that ends up in these training models, um, it's hard to parse out, and we don't have like a log of everything that they pulled and ingested. And so it is not necessarily possible to kind of go in and like surgically excise information. We don't know how many times the same thing got ingested, or, that version of the material, that might be slightly different or came from a different source was, incorporated into a data model. So the problem is that we don't have either technical protections in terms of like ways to prevent things from being like scraped or incorporated, because we don't know exactly when or how people are doing that. And so I get questions like, well, can't you do something to like prevent people to like, from doing that? And the answer is kind of like, no, we don't really have those technical protections yet. And once it's been incorporated, there isn't like a log or like a table of contents that says everything that's in there. So one, we don't know what's in there, so we can't tell you for certain. That gives them a bit of plausible deniability too about what's been incorporated into the data set. But so we don't know, and so we don't know if it's actually in there. We don't know where to look. We don't know how many copies of it there are, and we don't know how to kind of pull it out. The hallucinations thing is a little bit different. So the thing is that the most of the AI models do not know how to determine or like know the difference between fact and fiction. They're not actually thinking. They're just creating new things based on examples of other things. So, if you ask it to, tell you about, a really great book on the subject of, what scholarly communications, it might tell you about a book that it had ingested into its corpus, based on something it scraped off the internet, or it could make up a title and tell you, create a completely made up summary. And you're right that that is a dangerous source of misinformation, particularly if people are doing things like using ChatGPT to ask questions about the news, because it's got all this stuff from the New York Times ingested. Yes, it could draw on those, but it could also just kind of make something up. And that is something that we know happens all of the time. And so even when you're using an AI that had a very curated data set, we don't necessarily have a lot of guardrails or assurances that it's not going to make things up, which is part of that sort of like after process of, if you get an output or something from an AI, you have to, in your thinking thought process about whether or not this is, a good thing to incorporate into your process, decide whether you have the time to verify and go through and make sure that the information that it's given you is actually correct.
it's the last presenter started her talk about there was a disclosure about fear. I feel a little bit more afraid I feel now. But that's wow, there's an endless amount of considerations surrounding this topic and these elements. Greg, I see your hand raised. Please.
Yeah, very nice, Michelle. Thank you very much. I have a question, and I'm asking this from ignorance because I have never used an AI model to do this. Your point is very well taken about, inputting some document that might contain copyrighted information to have some analysis done by a model. Do those typically ask the user if you give that they, a question, do you give permission to use this information as a training set, or you just have to look in the statement of use and it just says, hey, we're going to use everything you input for training purposes? Is there a choice that's ever given to the user?
So it's the latter.
Is
In
it?
almost every situation. So that's one of the reasons to go and read those user agreements, because you're not going to get a pop-up that's like, oh, this looks great. Can I have a copy of this to use, you know, for other people's stuff? That doesn't happen. But it's sort of implicit in the terms of use, you know, that you when you create an account or use these things, that's, you know, something that you've agreed to by using the thing. There are situations, I believe it's the University of Michigan that has set up an individual license for ChatGPT for their institution. And this has allowed them to create a sort of like fenced in version that is, you know, that they can use and put stuff into, and the stuff that goes into that particular model and is, you know, part of that doesn't feed into the larger model of the main ChatGPT data set. And so there are, I mentioned in one of the sections, you know, there's one of those little like plus and minus charts, licensed versions of some of these softwares or locally hosted versions of the tools might give you more control over the training data sets and what goes in and what comes out and that sort of thing. But most of the stuff that's hosted publicly on the web is, you should assume that it's just going into the training data set. Yeah, and you can't delete it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think that might be all we have time for, but just very appreciative for coming and talking to us about this really important topic. So thank you so much.